Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 258, the Monstrum Opus of Sherlock Holmes.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello there, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, you're looking opulent this evening.
Am I really opulent?
Well, it was either that or monstrous. I picked one of the two words out of the title.
Oh, I like that. I can opine that you look opulent as well. I like that. Not monstrous, but I like that. Very good.
Well, populous, opulous, whoever knows. I'm wearing my Oculus, so...
Oh, I'm sorry. You're never going to get the money back for that on eBay. Sorry.
It's a major rift. Well, anyway, we are here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. You can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/ihose258, all lowercase. That'll take you directly to the ihearofsherlock.com website to this specific show's notes. You can also look through what we've got in the notes section of the podcast catcher that you happen to be listening to us on. Whatever works for you, that's fine, but just make sure you're subscribed to us. And if you're in Apple Podcasts, if you wouldn't mind giving us a rating and or a review, that's up to you. We'd love to hear your feedback, hear what you think of our little show, which we have described as fresh air for Sherlockians as we do these interviews here. And the interview here today that we're going to be doing is always welcome. Two people that have been with us here before. We'll talk a little bit about that, but first, let's tell you a little bit about each one of them. Brad Keefauver is still bitter he wasn't asked to write for this collection and was condemned instead to work in the galleys, but he still manages somehow to enjoy all of the writers within the collection of the Monstrum Opus of Sherlock Holmes. Well, that is, despite his utter jealousy of all of them. Yet, he's also a host of the Watsonian Weekly podcast, the editor of Sherlockian Chronology Timelines, and he blogs under the title of Sherlock Peoria, among other creative endeavors. Yet he's still a bitter old Sherlockian, and possibly a monster in his own right. But if you're collecting essays for a book, well, please invite him to write something, and maybe he'll be less bitter. Rob Nunn is the Gassigine of the Parallel Case of St. Louis and a member of many other Sherlockian groups. He's the co-editor of The Finest Assorted Collection, author of The Commonplace Book and The Criminal Mastermind of Baker Street, and he's the recipient of the Beacon Award for the Sherlock Holmes unit that he teaches to his 5th grade students. He lives in Edwardsville, Illinois with his wife and daughter and interviews other Sherlockians on his blog, Interesting Though Elementary. Brad and Rob, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Hi, glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, you are both repeaters here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Brad, you were with us last on episode 56, where we talked about your blog, Sherlock Peoria, all the way back in season 7. Lo, these 10 years ago. So I hope you're all limbered up and ready for this.
Oh, yeah. I had a Watson Caipirinha before this.
There you go. And you've been doing a little bit of podcasting since we last spoke, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. I've got the Watsonian Weekly, which is the John H. Watson Society podcast. Goes out every Sunday night, usually. It's about 15 minutes when it's going well. And then occasionally we do Sherlock Holmes is Real, which is something Paul Thomas Miller and I do that's a little off the wall.
Well, not for him.
No.
Or for you, really. But it's great to have you back here, and we will have links to both Sherlock Holmes is Real and the Watsonian Weekly for listeners who happen to be fans of podcasts. At least we hope they are, given that they're listening to this. And Rob Nunn, you join us here again for the 4th time. You were here with us first on episode 142 to talk about the criminal mastermind of Baker Street, and then again in episode 220 with your interesting, though elementary, blog, and most recently in episode 244 with Peter Eckrich, where you talked about the finest assorted collection. So, Rob, welcome back.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, this is a very different book, the Monstrum Opus of Sherlock Holmes. Where did the genesis of this idea come from in the first place?
Yeah, with a strange book like this, you think it would come from Brad Keefauver, but actually it was Ray Betzner. It was actually Ray Betzner's fault. Ray is, for those of you that don't know, a well-known Sherlockian out on the East Coast, and he has this great theory behind the Copper Beeches and the story with the son in there, Edward Rewcastle. And I heard and read that a couple times, and we thought, what if there's other people out there who could come up with weird things along the lines of Ray? And we threw out the net, and there are some weird Sherlockians out there.
Well, I mean, that's almost repetitive in some ways. I mean, every Sherlockian has a little bit of weirdness about them. I think that's what is so charming about this hobby. And I'll leave it to the two of you, since you're the editors, to remark on any spoilers. I don't want to give away any of these, because they all have a very each story has its own unique approach. Each essay has its own approach. So, but when you think about the weirdness of these stories, the weirdness of Sherlockians in general, where do you think that comes from?
Well, I think there's a natural inclination because, Holmes, I don't know, it's almost like the thing you can't have, because Holmes was very much, there's no vampires, there's no ghosts, no supernatural. It was all about logic and science. So it's almost like this drive is to put him with the one thing that isn't in the stories and isn't ever going to be in the stories just because it isn't. It's like black market.
I like that. It's the Sherlock Holmes that you always wanted but never could have.
I think there's a fine line between weirdness and creativity. If you tilt your head one way, it's one of those words. And if you tilt your head the other way, you just look at it and think, oh, wow.
Well, and it seems to me like that could apply to some of the original canon.
Very much so.
Are there any stories that come to mind that you can pull out, Rob, that you think, oh, well, that's weird, or it's slightly the other way?
Yeah, I think the Lion's Mane always stands out to me as just kind of an outlier in the canon. It is, told from a different point of view. It's in a completely different setting. and the quote unquote villain isn't even of human form. So I think you look at it one way, it's a weird story. If you look at it another, it's a wonderful tale of Holmes in retirement.
Well, that's an interesting way to look at it, and there are lots of examples in the canon of nature intruding on the action of the characters. I think of the Grimpen Mire, for example, this spooky atmosphere and the spectral hound. So there is, I suppose, some precedent for it. Tell me a little bit about Nathaniel Barker Harris, because I was intrigued to find his backstory. His mother apparently was the hostess of a TV show that was focused on horror movies and monster movies and things like that. That sounds fascinating.
Oh yeah, I mean, she was a creature feature hostess in a little TV station in Moorville, Kansas, if that should tell you something about the nature of the Barker family. That just kind of fit into the theme where, Nathaniel Barker Harris wound up being our kind of Rod Serling for this book, giving a little kind of like in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, how they'd always have a little intro to each story. So he kind of introduced each article in this.
Ah.
Well, and I have to ask this because that introduction was intriguing to me. Carnella Carney Barker. It doesn't get any better than that. Mother of Nathaniel Barker Harris. Is Nathaniel Barker Harris an actual person, or are you two kind of giving us a wink and a nod here?
I would have to say the wink and the nod there.
All right. Now I feel a little better about that because it's so well done that immediately when you're reading the introduction to just get into this book, you're sucked right in, right? And I think that is the charm of these stories is they take us to a familiar area, but through a different portal and through a different experience. And in some ways, we're asked to truly suspend our disbelief, but in other ways, we're being led down a path. And by the time we reach the end of the path, we look back and we go, actually, that makes a lot of sense, and I can see how I got here.
Well, that was one of the things we went for was, there's so many books of pastiches out there now and stuff that we went, okay, let's do the supernatural kind of thing, but do articles. Because I've always liked the scholarly articles that take the canon and take it off in some direction and give you a perspective on a story that you just would never have got from the story. It helps our enjoyment of it, I think. So then we took that and put 2 rules down. We said, because Holmes said no ghosts need apply, no ghosts for this book. And since he said vampires were rubbish, no vampires either. So we cut those 2 out.
Yeah.
But that still leaves the field wide open for all other kinds of influences, doesn't it?
Oh, and we got all other kinds.
Holy cow, yeah.
So how did you go about tracking down authors who would not only be willing to follow those ground rules that you set out, but who would also be creative enough to be able to imagine a parallel universe, as it were, a different way of looking at stories that we're all familiar with?
We reached out to people that we knew that we thought, hey, you seem like you may be interested in writing about the macabre.
You seem weird.
You seem weird. Come along with us. That's how we got Burt. But then, we also just posted an open call saying, hey, this is what we're thinking of doing. We put it out on Twitter and Facebook, and each of us have our own blog. So we put it on there. And we got a few names that were new to us. And it was a joy and a delight. I mean, it was so much fun to see new people say, hey, this is my kind of thing. I can't sit around digging through old encyclopedias, but I can get creative and then back that up with some mythological lore. So they really kind of came from all corners.
Yeah.
And you carried that through in the design of the book, too. I really have to ask you about the cover, because there are are so many scenes in Harry Potter and in other movies and TV shows that involve old books that are taken down from a shelf and they're full of spells and things like that. And the cover of this beautifully reproduces some of the texture and the look and the feel and the lettering of those old forgotten books. You never really know what's inside of them. Who did the design of the cover? It's really fabulous.
Oh, I did that design, and there's a secret Sherlockian connection there because it's from an old book that was Insects Abroad by the Reverend J.G. Wood. And I kind of took a couple of his insects and altered them a little bit and changed the title and everything to make that.
Oh, well done.
It really is. I mean, to me, as you're looking at this book, not only when it's in your hands, but looking at it online, and we'll have an image so people can see the cover. When you're looking at it online, it does look like one of those old, hardbound books from the early 1900s or so. And when I received my copy in the mail, I was, I'll be honest, I was disappointed to find that it was paperback. But as I'm holding the paperback in my hand, I can almost reach out and feel how I think it should feel if it were hardbound. And it is just, it's gorgeous to hold in my hand, as well as, a pleasure to hold in my hands that I read it. So
Brad really created a beautiful piece on the front and back of this book. I can just look at it forever and constantly find something new that I appreciate.
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about the design. So, but that's minor compared to what we want to talk with you about, with regard to the book. So, there's one thing as we've been talking about this, and I think Rob, you called it out earlier about the perspective, tilting your head one way versus another. I would imagine that as you're looking at these stories and essays, the authors need to be able to pull that off. They need to be able to kind of walk that line where there's a level of believability and they're convincing you that this different perspective that they're taking is worth doing. Because it's not, if it's done in a ham-handed way, suddenly the veil is off and, we're all kind of behind the scenes and it's not as fun. Kind of like you did with the introduction with Nathaniel Barker Harris. It was done so artfully that it's believable. So talk with us a little bit about how you worked with the authors of all these essays to ensure some kind of consistency about that dual nature.
Some of them came to us pretty well fully formed. I mean, when you're working with somebody like Nancy Holder, you just kind of step back and say, we're going to let the maestro work. I mean, man, does she just paint a beautiful story here. But others, it was such a fine line between creative expository writing and a pastiche. There was a lot of times we'd go back to an author and we'd say, hey, this one line just kind of drifts into pastiche, or, they'd get really into their topic and all of a sudden they've got dialogue between characters. Well, we got to dial that back, and we have to keep trying to present this as quote unquote fact that, Sherlock Holmes did interact with this monster, or Sherlock Holmes actually worked with this type of entity, that type of thing. And everybody was really amenable to it. Everybody was very open to the thing because, I mean, we tried to get across from the front like this. We just want to make a fun book, but we want it to be consistent throughout.
What about you, Brad? I mean, I know you have a lot of experience certainly with creative writing, creative podcasting as well. Talk a little bit about what you saw in this process.
Well, to me, this is the heart of Sherlockiana, is that, I've never been too much on the factual Conan Doyle side of it. I've always been on the Watson wrote the stories side of it. So to me, even though it's, the monsters and the supernatural, it's still the same way that I've always preferred to play the game, and coming up with mixing a little history with a little fiction, a little fancy with a little fact to produce this kind of effect. So, I mean, that's where I came from on it. And a lot of Sherlockians, I think, have, absorbed a little of that atmosphere over the years and kind of have a knack for it.
Yeah, I think it's fun to see the different ways that people go to express that, because there are some people who just are completely immersed in the game, and as you say, kind of stay true to that Watson as author approach. Others that kind of are more fluid in their analysis. So, and we all, the beauty of Sherlockians and our own individual weirdness, I think, is we each bring our own flavor, our own perspective that is unique to the canon and to our own ways of interpretation. And Burt, I'm going to kind of turn the sights on you a little bit here, as I did in the last episode. You have been long involved with the Cornish horrors of Rhode Island, and managed to swing that into a major story, which I did not see this coming. I mean, obviously I know of your association with the Devil's Foot and Cornish horrors, etc., but I did not see the twist that you introduced into this story.
Well, a lot of it was there already, and that's part of the beauty of this. The fact that, at the time that the cases of Sherlock Holmes were first appearing, was a great time for Gothic and horror novels. And also, novels that weren't necessarily, stories that weren't necessarily about creatures or the supernatural, but also stories that dove down into human experience and existence, like a lot of the stuff that George Gissing wrote. And, you can see it all over the place. But in the Adventure of the Devil's Foot, right from the beginning, Watson says, we've arrived at a spot peculiarly well suited to the grim humor of my patient. And all of this, there are a lot of inconsistencies and oddities about the whole thing. Watson tells you about Holmes being suddenly so run down that he needs a complete change of scene and air. And then they decide to go to this bizarre spot on the western coast of England. The whole sinister semicircle of Mounts Bay, that old death trap of sailing vessels with its fringe of black cliffs on which innumerable seamen have met their end. The wise mariner stands far out from that evil place. And so it was really all there, and all I did was put it down on the page, helped, of course, by the fact that Providence, Rhode Island, which is the home of the Cornish horrors, is also the home of H.P. Lovecraft. And actually, my essay explores that connection many fathoms deep, you might say.
Yeah. And, there's a nice tie-in here that you mentioned Phil Schreffler's help with respect to Leoness as kind of an Atlantis of Southwest England, as it were, the birthplace of Tristan, who was a knight of the Round Table. So here we get into the realms of mythology. And I don't know if you recall the BBC radio adaptation of The Devil's Foot that Burt Coules did. But there was a wonderful integration of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, which the haunting melodies there, and the Holmes kind of getting under the spell of the Devil's Foot root, etc., just worked really well as this not only Wagnerian but medieval mythology was interwoven with the present day of Holmes and Watson.
Yeah, I do. Well, that was, just a lovely compliment. But I found that, so many of these sort of literary, and I think that for me in putting the thing together, part of my approach was to see how I could manage the mood, to start with a sort of a fairly typical review of inconsistencies and puzzling things, and then sort of slip it past the reader, when you're sort of making the connection to these otherworldly types of possibilities. And I was helped by the fact that The Devil's Foot itself harkens back to the 16th century in lines from a poem by John Donne. Go and catch a falling star, get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all past years are, or who clift the devil's foot. Teach me to hear the mermaids singing, or to keep off envy's stinging. So, there's a lot of, and it'd been a while since I'd thought about that. The etymology of the devil's foot, and it going back to John Donne and things like that.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, there's so much that's right here in front of us, ripe for the picking. And in some ways, Cornwall manages to portray itself as a setting worthy of evil. I mean, it's not that far past Dartmoor, really. Just keep heading southwest, and you'll get there. I think it rivals Dartmoor and the Grimpen Mire for setting and feeling.
Well, and the great asset too you have when you're thinking about this from the standpoint of the cases of Sherlock Holmes is the experiment that Holmes so injudiciously conducts with the Radix Pedis Diaboli and this lamp that he's bought, just like Brenda Tregennis's lamp, and the fumes and their effect on Holmes and Watson. And that and it doesn't take very much to look at that experience that they had and to say, well, boy, that reminds me of something that Lovecraft talked about.
We're going to pause here a moment for a quick word from our sponsor. Hey, it's a new year, and that means new content. Lots of new content coming from our friends at MX Publishing. Now, it doesn't have to be a new year to find new content from MX Publishing. In fact, if you sign up for their newsletter, you'll get updated every week about some of the latest. For example, every week, Steve MX sends out THIF. Thank Holmes, it's Friday. And in the most recent one, there's a news about a Kickstarter campaign, Sherlock Holmes and the Unmasking of the Whitechapel Horror. Then there are free audiobooks, including The Keys of Death by Gretchen Altebeff, Sherlock Holmes, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Volume 1 by David McGregor, and The Bird and the Buddha Before Watson, Book 2 by A.S. Croyle. That and Sherlock Sunday. Every week you'll get an update about new Sherlock Holmes books. All you have to do is go to the wessexpress.com homepage, go all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see a little box there to sign up for the newsletter where you can get information about promotions, new products, and sales. Make sure you check it out and see exactly all of the great content that's coming from our friends at MX Publishing.
But I'm curious, in talking to Rob and Brad. Brad, why don't we start with you? Have you always have you had an interest in monster movies and some of these Gothic novels and things like that? Is that something that's been an interest of yours?
Yes, definitely. Actually, I can trace my entire love of Sherlock Holmes back to a monster. Because when I was in junior high, I only...
That's not kind to talk about your teacher that way.
Well, I was very voracious reader, but at that point in my life, I wasn't into fiction yet. I was just into fact. But being a kid, I wanted to read about dinosaurs and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. And one weekend, I went to the theater, the little local theater called the Strand, oddly enough, and I saw a preview for this movie that had the Loch Ness Monster in it. And Sherlock Holmes was fighting the Loch Ness Monster. But as bad luck would have it, my parents took us away on a trip the weekend that movie was coming to town, so I didn't get to see that movie for years, and it just always haunted me. This whole thing with Sherlock Holmes and the Loch Ness Monster. So that kind of piqued my interest and kept me looking after Sherlock Holmes for a long time after that.
Now, this movie would have been The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yes, indeed. And it was such a fun thing because when I finally saw it on network television in the old days when you just had the channels, they actually edited it down, cut out the ballet scene at the first. So then I saw it, was real excited, and then found out, oh, they'd cut some out, saw it with a little more, got the ballet scene, and then found, oh, wait, they cut it so much from the original stuff that Billy Wilder had, and then they started releasing that stuff. So it's been quite a journey following that movie.
And there's a good 25 minutes or so that Billy Wilder had to cut from the original film that's never been fully restored.
Oh, yeah.
Lost, yeah.
Yeah, sadly. Well, that's really interesting, Brad, because those days, would have been the early 1970s or so, it seems like the world in general, or at least our world, was filled with this interest in the occult. You had this surge of interest in the Loch Ness Monster, in Bigfoot. I remember watching a $6 Million Man episode where Bigfoot was featured in one of them. The Bermuda Triangle, and this, of course, would have been around the same time that Leonard Nimoy started the In Search Of series, which involved all of these mysterious and otherworldly kinds of things. It seems like it was the perfect time for the collusion of Sherlock Holmes and the occult.
Well, yeah, when you think about, Conan Doyle really teased us so much with Sherlock Holmes, with the Devil's Foot, the Hound of the Baskervilles, the Speckled, all these things that were, on the edge of supernatural, but then Holmes would always clear it up. So, the fact that he just kept teasing us, the fact that, when those subjects started becoming popular, it's only natural, I guess, that he would kind of head that way.
Has anyone ever done Sherlock Holmes meets Bigfoot?
I don't think so. That's still out there.
I think Larry Hagman.
That there's a fan fiction out there.
I think Larry Hagman did something, but it was set in a shoe store, if I remember.
Oh goodness. Yeah. Well, so that's a pretty hefty introduction to Sherlock Holmes, Brad. Coming in by way of the Loch Ness Monster. Were you more intrigued or disappointed when you delved into Sherlock Holmes? What was your experience early on?
Well, I think, I didn't dive in too much until I hit college. And at that point, after the 7% solution had proved that Sherlock Holmes could make some money and things were a little looser on the rights, all these pasticheurs were coming out with, Sherlock Holmes' War of the World, The Adventure of the Peerless Peer. Sherlock Holmes was in some books that had monsters in them and things. So I segued pretty cleanly into pastiches that didn't have monsters then, and the canon itself. So that's kind of what brought me back to, and I've never been disappointed, I don't think.
Mm. And Rob, what about you and monsters?
No, I'm the complete opposite of Brad. Monsters have just never really done much for me. I grew up in the age of, the Freddy Krueger movies, and I watched a few and I thought, okay, that was fun, and then never really cared to follow up. With classic literature, I'm just now in my mid 40s starting to appreciate, just how well things like Frankenstein were written. I tried reading Frankenstein about 10 years ago and remember thinking, this is terrible. Why do people like this? So it took me a long time to learn to appreciate stuff like that. Thank God for like Les Klinger's Annotated that helped you understand those things, because I didn't have an English teacher to kind of walk me through that stuff. So the monster bug never really bit me. But I guess the editing and the analytical side of it was what was really interesting to me with this project. So I think Brad and I worked really well, where he's the really creative guy And I was like, okay, but we got to stay, kind of somewhere in between these lines. And Brad's like, you know what? Let's color everything.
I'm a horrible editor. So Rob is the best one on that. I've edited many journals and things, but it's not my natural thing. I'm the one that's just going to go off on the crazy idea.
I understand your pain.
And what about some of the classic horror films? Do either one of you have any fondness for those? You mentioned Frankenstein, of course, but in the 1930s and 40s, Universal did all these whole run of horror pictures. The Invisible Man, the werewolf, Dracula goes here and there and everywhere.
Oh, yeah, the theater where I saw the Private Life thing, they would run Saturday matinees for the parents to get rid of their kids and run those old black and white movies in the theater, along with Godzilla and anything else. So, yeah, I grew up on a steady diet of old classic monsters. I had the old Revell models of Frankenstein and the Mummy, those kind of things.
Yeah, I just missed all of that. I was busy with, G.I. Joes and things. But
well, but the good news is, look at your experience, with Frankenstein. It's not too late.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's never too late. What's interesting to me as the Universal monster movies were kind of coming off of their high, late 1930s or so. That, of course, is when Sherlock Holmes was introduced by way of Basil Rathbone. And it didn't take too long into the 1940s as they kept the franchise alive with a lot of these monsters that, they would just happen to meet these two guys by the name of Abbott and Costello. And it seems like there could have been a crossover back then with the Mummy and Dracula and Frankenstein and the Invisible Man and the rest with Sherlock Holmes if Universal were really up for it.
Yeah, I think it's a shame that... Oh, go ahead, Rob.
No, go ahead. I was just going to...
I think it's a shame that when you think of all the kind of movies Basil Rathbone wound up in later in his career, with the Hammer film and different things that, I saw something just this weekend. My wife had this thing on called The Black Sleep. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's got Basil Rathbone, Tor Johnson. There's an alligator man. There's just crazy stuff going on in that thing. And, it's a great wild horror movie. And here's, the guy that played Sherlock Holmes right in the middle of it. So I think there was a natural thing there that just never quite happened.
Well, he did get close, Rathbone, in the Comedy of Terrors. And that film you mentioned, is a. I just love all these old movies, but in the Comedy of Terrors, you had Peter Lorre and Vincent Price and Karloff and Rathbone, who was playing. He was playing their landlord, I think, Mr. Black, and he was forever being put in a coffin because he appeared to be dead, but he actually had narcolepsy. So Rathbone would always wake up and in the box and say, "What place is this?" And I think that's the last line of the picture, as I remember it.
Wasn't Rathbone in one of the Frankenstein sequels, whether it was like
Son of Frankenstein?
Yeah, he was
Son of Frankenstein. Sure, he was.
But not as Sherlock Holmes. That's the only thing.
No. It's a shame they didn't put Sherlock Holmes in his later movie, Hillbillies in a Haunted House. That would have been really would have elevated that one.
That is one of the all-time worst horror movies. And, while we're at it, we missed the opportunity to see Abbott and Costello meet Sherlock Holmes.
Well, yeah, but you see, you couldn't do that because, Dracula and Frankenstein and the Mummy and all of the people that Abbott and Costello met are all fictional, and Holmes, of course, is real. So you couldn't really do that in a movie.
All right,
it wouldn't make
Abbott
any
and Costello
sense.
meet Basil Rathbone.
Maybe Sherlock Holmes could have solved the mystery of who's on first.
I like that.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about some of the features here in the book? Again, I will leave it to the discretion of you two as editors as to how much you want to give away. But in addition to Burt's allusion to Lovecraft. Well, what other compelling stories do we have from the monstrous opus of Sherlock Holmes, Monstrum Opus of Sherlock Holmes?
I really enjoy just the scope and sequence of so many different things. We've got, Paul Thomas Miller, who, when he puts his pen to paper, you're getting something worth reading. And he went into ancient Greek mythology with his, I won't give anything away with there. But then on the flip side, we've got somebody that connects a very unlikely story to The Wizard of Oz. And both arguments are, as about as plausible as you could be in connecting Sherlock Holmes to these monsters. But I went back and reread the essays because it's been a while since we put this book together. I went back and reread them yesterday and today, and I was just like, oh, wow, I forget just like every chapter is just a hard left turn into something completely different.
Yeah, we give away a little bit of the range. I mean, we go from the Terror of Blue John Gap to Ghostbusters mythology to the Tommyknockers, Aboriginal goddesses. I mean, it's all over the map. Like you said, a lot of, sharp left turns.
Yeah, we've got a sentient house, a basilisk, which I didn't even know what it was at the time. I had to look it up. Just so much fun. And, two different authors, M.K. Wiseman and Phil Burgum, dip into other Conan Doyle stories and connect Holmes to the monsters that appear in those.
Yeah, and that's what strikes me is Conan Doyle he really was into the occult in a number of the stories that he wrote, and he managed to draw a fairly solid line between those true occult stories and the Sherlock Holmes, although, as you mentioned before, Brad, there is a little bit of leakage into Sussex Vampire, Creeping Man, Hound of the Baskerville, Speckled Man, etc. But talk a little bit about Conan Doyle's skill with stories of the occult.
Well, that is one thing. I mean, like I was saying earlier, he brings it out in the Sherlock Holmes stories, but then, he has his own horror stories that he's done, that are coming a little more to the fore now as people are, like the Terror of Blue John Gap's been getting some attention lately that is kind of nice.
And Horror of the Heights has always been a good one. Lot 249, one of the original Mummy stories.
Yeah. This really was one of the defining elements of Victorian era fiction, and Horror of the Heights is a good one because it also locates the events and the action around the science of the day. And in the science of the day, air travel was very new, and it's difficult for people in the 21st century to sort of put themselves in that position. But in those days, it would not be clear to you what there was at 30,000 feet because nobody had ever been there. And so Conan Doyle's story, The Horror of the Heights, is all about a pilot who appears to encounter pilots who appear to encounter awful terrors and ghouls at 30,000 feet when they fly that high. Now, they didn't. In those planes of the day, they really couldn't have gotten to 30,000 feet. But, it's really a chilling little story.
Spoiler alert, they were Chinese spy balloons, right?
No, they were weather balloons. Whether or not you're going to shoot it down, we're setting up a balloon.
And I think that's where so much horror can really lie, is at that cutting edge of what is known and what's unknown. The way that Doyle wrote, he was always very, prescient in what is happening now, whether it's the trends in crime or trends in science. And he would always try to look, it seemed like one or two steps past that. And that's where you get some of this really creative stuff, even if it seems very dated to some of us now. Something like Horror of the Heights or Blue John Gap, like looking down in these caverns. Today, people would think, well, you just take a flashlight down there. You have to really put yourself in that mindset of that wasn't an option back then. But that's no different than people thinking of like the Alien movies when they first came out, thinking how terrifying that would be. And now we're just like, we know that doesn't exist. I mean, so the man was, he seemed, not always, but so often was at the cutting edge of a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I think, Rob, that's where, I mean, even with Sherlock Holmes, I mean, not only the cutting edge of crime, but the setting in London, the realism there, it blurred the lines. And that's why people would write to Sherlock Holmes in real life. They would write letters to 221B Baker Street. Abbey National Bank used to have an entire full-time role, a secretary that did nothing but answer letters that arrived at their address because of Conan Doyle's skill in merging fantasy with reality. And it worked with the Sherlock Holmes stories. It worked with some of his horror stories. And that, I think, is what makes him such a great storyteller.
Yeah, I think you could really actually come up with a whole book of monster stories just from Conan Doyle. If you think about Lost World and some of those were,
Yeah.
And Victorian London seemed like it was such a hotbed of these great monstrous tales, whether it's, Jekyll and Hyde or Dracula coming out about then. But also you could look at like the monster inside of you. Shanna Carter connected the Milverton story to, oh my goodness,
Dorian Gray.
Dorian Gray. Thank you. The picture of Dorian Gray, and really says like, yeah, there's the metaphysical element, but the real monster was his behavior and how it went from there. And there were so many different books that we thought, oh, somebody could take off on this, somebody could take off on this. It seemed to be just an embarrassment of riches for great literature back then.
Well, the book is an embarrassment of riches. That is for certain, both within and without. It is the Monstrum Opus of Sherlock Holmes, edited by Brad Keefauver and Rob Nunn. Gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us here and sharing your tales of horror on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Interesting. In this conversation, it's the first time I think we've talked to an editor who really, there was some text and some weight there around exactly what the editorial process was. And I'm always interested in that. And I think the guidance that was given to the writers, was really worthwhile. I thought that was very interesting. And what a great topic this is.
Well, it really is. And, I meant to ask them if there will be a volume 2, because it seems like there's room for it, given what we've seen here, given the enthusiasm behind it. I suppose it also depends on the response to this volume, whether a second one will come out as well. So, but hey, as long as I have you here, Burt, I wanted you to turn to your essay, toward the end of your essay, and I wondered if you might read us out of this section with that lovely poem that Les Daniels wrote for the Cornish Horrors.
Oh, I'd be pleased to. Thank you for asking. Well, Les is a much missed departed member of the Cornish Horrors who was a screenwriter, wrote books about great comic characters like Sherlock Holmes and Batman and Wonder Woman. And so I really commend folks to go to ABE Books and see if you can find some of the things that Les wrote. But years ago, he wrote this poem called Cornwall's Secluded Coast, which we recite at every meeting of the Cornish Horrors. The wise mariner stands far out from that evil place, where blind fear marks a woman's frozen face. Was she frightened by a demon or a ghost that crept along Cornwall's secluded coast? Something moves among the bushes in the dark, and 3 are stricken senseless with no mark. To what inhuman thing did they play host at night upon Cornwall's secluded coast? Black cliffs and ancient ruins mark the place where the master solved his strangest case and found a drug more menacing than most, imported to Cornwall's secluded coast. The atmosphere is stuffy in the room, and even heroes contemplate their doom when devil's foot root powder starts to roast in flames along Cornwall's secluded coast. The greatest horrors lurk inside the mind, but spirits sometimes help the mind unwind. So, fellow horrors, let us drink a toast in honor of Cornwall's secluded coast. What was Conan Doyle really like? Thanks to American journalists, now we know, and you can know too, when you get your copy of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers, Volume 6, just published in January. Volume 6 covers the first month of Conan Doyle's tour of the United States in October 1894. Just 4 weeks, but it produced 230 pages of articles, interviews, reports from his lectures, and much more. And because of American interviewers, it's the first time we get really close to Conan Doyle the man. They tell us what he looks like, his way of moving and talking, and all those little things that form a three-dimensional image of the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Get your copy of Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle in the newspapers, Volume 6, edited and annotated by Matthias Bostrom and Mark Alberstadt at wessexpress.com today.
All right, from the seclusion of Cornwall to the relative occlusion of everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. That's right, it's Canonical Couplets, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and we ask you to tell us which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about. If you recall, the last time around these parts, we asked you to solve this clue. The linguist, quite intimidated by an evil-looking truncheon, was left at Wandsworth Common, about a mile from Clapham Junction. Burt, oh yes. Burt, yes. Speaking of the horrors, yes. Do you know which story we're talking about here?
Yes, it involves the royal family, and it was the theft of Queen Victoria's favorite knitting pattern. That's the case Watson called The Blue Cardigan Plans.
Missed it by that much.
No, I'm sorry. We did not manage it this time. That's astounding.
Would you believe?
Would you believe? No. I'll be over here in the cone of silence if you need me.
No, it's the Conan of silence.
Oh, well, let's turn to our friend Eric Deckers. He says, I've solved it. It's the story where Dr. Watson finally met Sherlock's older, corpulenter sibling. It's the story called He Ain't Heavy, He's My... No, wait, he's heavy. Hold on, I'm confusing this story with the Hollies song from 1969. This is the story, The Greek Interpreter. Oh. Yes, Eric, The Greek Interpreter. That is indeed what we're looking for. Burt, you didn't manage to get it, but we did have a number of other people who did. So we're going to bring out the big prize wheel and give it a spin. And it's slowing down, landing on number 29. And that corresponds to Shanna Carter. Congratulations. We will be getting you your prize, which I believe is a copy of The Haven Horror. So stay tuned for that. Well, in this case, we have another prize available for this Canonical Couplet. The prize is a copy of the Monstrum Opus of Sherlock Holmes, edited by Brad Keefauver and Rob Nunn. And here is your clue. Watson knew the man who came to Holmes quite agitated. The miscreant may rise to heights once he's been emigrated. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@IHearOfSherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. All right. What a great show. I can't believe we've done this.
Fabulous, fabulous.
We keep cranking them out. Well, and we have more in store in the weeks ahead. We have a lot of great guests lined up. You want to make sure you are subscribed to us on whatever podcast platform you happen to listen to us on. If it's on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts or SoundCloud or wherever, just make sure you are following us or hit that subscribe button, and we will come back to you in about 15 days' time. Actually, this is February, so we'll be back even sooner than that, won't we?
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Huh.
this is the month where we don't have a 30th. So our shows drop on the 15th and 30th of every month, except for February. It's the cruelest month, isn't it?
Is it really the cruelest month?
I don't know. I'm as far as a podcast editor is concerned, yes, it is.
Maybe.
But yeah, and if you are not following us on Trifles, our other show that we do on a weekly basis, and we discuss some of the minutia in the Sherlock Holmes stories, check that out. It's at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com, or just search for Trifles in your podcast catcher. We'd be delighted to have you over there as a subscriber as well. Well, Burt, do you have anything else to say for yourself?
No, nothing. Done. Used all the words.
That is fantastic. Well, this is the worldly and wordly Scott Monty.
And this is the word-free Burt Wolder.
And together, we say, the game's
afoot.
The game's afoot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
Well, here's one I missed. Where should I tell people to go buy this?
Oh, it's on Amazon.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Plus, I'm going to be selling them at 221 Beacon, too, so they can pick up one there in person if they want.
We will add that back in. So
they can get a Nathaniel Barker Harris autograph.